Hi, I'm Danny Schechter. I'm your news dissector. I'm the director of the film Plunder, The Crime of Our Time. It's probably the 30th documentary that I've made. It's a film that looks at the financial crisis not as a business story, which is the way most of the press deals with it, or a political story, but as a crime story. What I try to do is what really most of our media has not done, is to look at how criminal activities and a disregard for the American people has resulted in this crisis. Right now, in the beginning of the year 2010, the administration claims, everything is coming back, the economy is in recovery, their program for financial recovery is working, they've pumped all this money in. Ben Bernanke is the cover boy of Time magazine, Man of the Year, for saving the economy from itself. Now, my view is very different, and I try to explain why in this film. But what we do know is that every time you hear a rosy projection, everything is going great, about a week later, you find out the markets collapsed, the economy is not coming back, 10% plus unemployment is continuing, 14 million families facing foreclosure. In other words, this is a structural crisis, not simply a problem, that happened because some people made mistakes. This has to do with the very nature of the volatility of our system. And most people in the media don't look at it that way. They don't have a historical perspective. They don't look at, what the real forces are that created that. And I try to in this film. And what my argument is really based on what actually happened. The housing market collapsed. Why? Because not only was interest rates cut, but fraudulent mortgages were pervasive. The FBI called it an epidemic, where people were induced to get into homes they couldn't afford deliberately. Why? So that the mortgages could then be resold, repackaged, rebundled, securitized, and resold all over the world to various banks and other financial institutions, coming with a rating from Moody's or other rating agencies that called them AAA investments, therefore the best kind of investment. And so a lot of people bought these mortgages, subprime mortgages largely, but not only subprime mortgages, because they believed that they were really solid asset-backed securities. And then it turned out, guess what? There were no assets backing these securities. In fact, there was nothing backing these securities. And so people bought into a product that was really misrepresented in its value. So that's part two of the crime. Part one, the fraud. Part two, the resale of it. Part three, the insuring of all of this by companies like AIG, who knew that, a lot of people would default on these mortgages, and so they insured the people who lent the money, and then they leveraged the money so they could borrow against it 30 times its value. So suddenly, a problem that was maybe a couple of $1 billion became a couple of $1 trillion, and up and up and up and on and on and on. And this was part of the game that was played by Wall Street. I mean, Obama says it. He says they knowingly sold mortgages to people who couldn't afford it. Well, guess what that is, folks? That's fraud. If you knowingly sell a lemon, a car that has no motor in it to somebody, and you don't, tell them that there's no motor in it, you go to jail for violating, consumer laws, violating various statutes. So here we have a situation where the bedrock of the whole crisis is fraud, is crime. And guess what? That's not the theme of most of the media. Most of the media has not taken that seriously. Why? Because the media needs a criminal. It needs a bad guy. It needs a Bernie Madoff, one man who does wrong. And then we can have a morality play. We can say, look at Bernie. He was so successful. He was at NASDAQ. He was so famous. And it turned out he's a complete fraud. He had a Ponzi scheme. He's lost $65 billion. Isn't that a shame? Now, the problem is that Bernie had nothing to do with this financial crisis. And the losses in this financial crisis are well beyond Bernie Madoff's $65 billion Ponzi scheme. We're talking now, potentially, one figure I saw, $171 trillion vanished, gone in the economy. So people have been ripped off and have ripped off themselves. That's what's ironic about this. Sort of what went around came around. The people who were making super profits were the ones who ended up losing their profits. And that's the story I tell in this film. And in a way, it's unfashionable, it's unpopular, because it's not about bad guys per se. It's about a bad system, a system that was allowed to capture the entire regulatory framework of America and get rid of it. Basically, $5 billion in lobbying starting way back in 1989 led to the deregulation of the whole industry. That means that they could get away with whatever they wanted to get away with. There was nobody paying attention. There was nobody looking. There was no cops on the beat. And as a result, they were given kind of carte blanche to make as much money as they could. And it was described by Alan Greenspan as innovation. It was so innovative what they were doing. There were these financial derivative products that nobody could explain, and very few of the people who were selling them even understood what they were. It sort of didn't matter because there was so much money being made. And that's the story of Plunder, because while some were getting very rich, Americans, the whole American middle class, was being basically destroyed. We have the greatest inequality ever in American society. Basically 70% of the wealth is owned by 1% of the people. Now, this is a situation that's more common in the third world. It's more common in the Congo, let's say, than in America. But nobody points that out because it's really, it raises deeper questions about who these people are and what they've done. And so that's what I've looked at in this film, Plunder, the Crime of Our Time. I've looked at how they did it, how they got away with it, what the techniques that were used. And in making the film, I didn't want to talk to like Noam Chomsky or left-wingers. I wanted to talk to people who are actually in the industry, who worked for Goldman Sachs, who worked for Bear Stearns, who worked for the Chase Bank, people who were insiders who could really reveal what was really going on. And so this is the story that was not told by the business channels. It was not told by CNBC. It was not told by the New York Times. Only later have pieces of this puzzle come together, but not really, in a way that you can comprehend it. There's no interconnection between things. The dots are not dotted. The T's are not crossed. And that's why it's up to an independent filmmaker. Now, I made a film called In Debt We Trust back in 2006, warning of this currency crisis, warning of the crash that was coming. Guess what? I was called a doom and gloomer. I was called an alarmist. I was called as somebody that didn't know what they were talking about. And guess what happened? Unfortunately, I was more right than I wanted to be. The economy did collapse. And now I've followed up with this new film, which is the Plunder, the Crime of Our Time. I hope you'll get a chance to see it, to look at it, to examine it, to share it with friends if you think it's important, to get it seen in your community on local TV or wherever, because it's going to be an uphill battle to get this film seen, because the forces that created the crisis are the forces that dominate the discussion of the crisis. The same assumptions, the same sort of analysis, which is basically not very deep, very superficial, and the rest. And I show how the media itself was captured, was basically co-opted here. That, I have somebody in the film arguing that just like the embedded journalists in Iraq basically told one side of the story, the embedded journalists on Wall Street looked the other way at some of these problems. My conclusion, we need a jail-out, not just a bailout. We need to hold these people accountable. We need an investigation. We need a prosecution. And we need to examine and explain to the American people what happened to their economy and what happened to their lives. That's what I'm trying to do in the film Plunder, the Crime of Our Time. Please let me know what you think when you see it. You can write to me at dissector@mediachannel.org. Give me some feedback. Give me suggestions about how we can get the film seen more widely. Thank you for watching, and thank you for acting on these issues once you have watched it.